The unforeseen encounter. It was a crisp Saturday morning when I decided to clear my head with a jog through the local park. My name is Kira, 30 years old, and I was no stranger to dealing with stress. As a corporate consultant, my job often left me drowning in data and deadlines, but that morning it was just me and the early sun. The world was still waking up. The birds were chirping, and the air was cool but fresh enough to invigorate the spirit. After a week that had felt like a never-ending grind, I was determined to enjoy this brief moment of peace. I laced up my sneakers, pulled on a simple tank top, and set off for my apartment in the city. The park was a short drive away, just far enough to escape the noise, but close enough that I could always come back when I needed to clear my head. It was one of those off-the-beaten-path parks, a quiet spot with open fields and large trees, tucked away from the bustle of the city. As I arrived, I found it nearly deserted, just how I liked it. There were a couple of early morning joggers off in the distance, but for the most part, it was just me, my thoughts, and the peaceful hum of the world awakening. I started running along the gravel path, my feet finding a rhythm. As I jogged, the week's frustrations began to melt away. The chaos of work seemed so distant here, almost irrelevant. The sound of my breathing matched the steady thump of my sneakers against the ground. It felt good to let my mind wander, to not have to focus on anything more pressing than the simple motion of putting one foot in front of the other. But as I ran further down the path, something changed. A feeling, subtle but present, crept into my chest. My pace slowed, and I glanced over my shoulder instinctively. That was when I first saw them. Two men in a police car, cruising slowly behind me on the path. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but as they got closer, I saw the way they were watching me. The car's tires crunched on the gravel as it pulled even with me, and the older officer, sitting in the driver's seat, gave me a pointed look. "Hey," he called, his voice sharp and commanding. I stopped, wiping a bead of sweat from my forehead, and turned toward him, unsure of what to expect. In the cool morning light, he looked as if he had just rolled out of bed, a little disheveled mid-30s, with a 5 o'clock shadow that was about a day past being acceptable. His partner, a slightly younger officer with dark, intense eyes, gave me a strange look, but said nothing. I assumed they were just curious about the lone jogger, but their stares felt different, almost like I had become the subject of a bad joke. "What are you doing out here?" the older officer asked, his gaze sweeping over me as though I didn't belong in the park. "It's early, don't you think?" I was taken aback. It was an innocent question, but there was an edge to his voice. I didn't understand what he was getting at. "I'm just running," I said, keeping my response polite. "Just out for some exercise." The officer leaned back in his seat, his eyes still trained on me. His partner, now leaning slightly out of the passenger window, gave me an unsettling smirk. "Out for a run, huh?" the younger one asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You sure you're just running, or are you hiding something?" I frowned, confusion mixing with a growing sense of discomfort. I had never been one to back down from a confrontation, but I knew better than to let irritation take over. "I'm not hiding anything," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "I'm just running to clear my head. I live nearby." But the older officer, who I started to think of as Officer Smirk, wasn't buying it. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned to his partner and muttered something I couldn't quite make out. There was a gleam in his eyes, a certain amusement that made me uneasy. "Why don't you go climb that tree over there?" Officer Smirk suggested suddenly, his tone light but condescending. He pointed to a large oak off to the side, its branches reaching high into the morning sky. I froze, caught off guard by the absurdity of the suggestion. Was he joking? I looked back at him, unsure if I had misheard him or if he was seriously asking me to climb a tree. "Excuse me?" I asked, trying to mask the incredulity in my voice. His smile only widened. "What, you're not up for a little challenge? Go ahead. Climb it. "Unless you're chicken," he taunted. A brief moment of silence passed, and I could feel my chest tighten with rising frustration. This was ridiculous. Who did they think they were, trying to make a joke out of me? I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. I knew better than to lose my temper with someone in authority, but this was going too far. "I'm just here to run, and I'm going to keep running," I said firmly, taking a small step back. But they weren't backing down. The younger officer, who had yet to speak, now smirked and stepped out of the car, slowly walking toward me. "Come on, it'll be fun," he said, his voice dripping with a mocking sweetness. "We won't bite." I looked around, half expecting someone else to step in, to witness this strange interaction. But the park was empty. No one else was around. There was no one to challenge their behavior. I tried to sidestep them, but the older officer blocked my path. He was standing too close now, an unspoken intimidation in his stance. "Look," I said, my voice tightening with controlled anger, "I'm not interested in whatever game you're playing. I just want to finish my run. So please, let me go." That's when it became clear to me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. They were toying with me, making me the butt of their joke. It was as if I had suddenly become a character in their sick little routine, a game to pass the time. Then, without warning, one of them, Officer Smirk, pulled out a rope. "We'll just tie you up then. How's that sound?" He let out a low chuckle, and my stomach twisted. This was no longer just a harmless inconvenience. This was harassment. But I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. "Listen," I said again, my voice unwavering, "this isn't funny, and I'm not going to play along." But Officer Smirk didn't listen. He wrapped the rope around my arms with disturbing ease, forcing me against the rough bark of the tree. I twisted and struggled, but they had me trapped. Every attempt to free myself only led to more laughter. I could feel the anger rising in my chest, my heart pounding in my ears. They didn't just want to humiliate me. They wanted to break my spirit. "You're really going to regret this," I muttered under my breath, my mind racing. I wasn't the kind of person to let something like this slide. Not when I knew what they were doing was completely unjust. One of them stepped back, pulling out his phone to take pictures, his finger poised to record. "Smile," he said, grinning. The humiliation was unbearable. I had never felt so powerless in my life. This was supposed to be my safe space, a place where I could escape the chaos of the world and find peace. Instead, I was being mocked, objectified, and trapped against a tree like some kind of sideshow attraction. But I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I held their gaze, my eyes burning with unspoken rage. "This is pathetic," I said, my voice steady but laced with fury. "You've got nothing better to do than tie a woman to a tree and take pictures." They didn't respond, but as the rope tightened around my arms, I knew this wasn't the end of it. It couldn't be. This was just the beginning. The unraveling. I hung there against the tree for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was only a matter of minutes. The two officers were enjoying themselves, laughing as though I were some kind of performance they were both getting a kick out of. I could hear their idle banter in the background. Comments about my appearance, jabs about my response to their challenge, and the occasional snap of a camera. At first, I tried to keep my anger in check, but the longer they mocked me, the more it boiled over. The ropes around my wrists cut into my skin, and the rough bark of the tree scraped against my back, making me wince with every shift. My mind raced, thinking of every way to break free, but none of them were practical. I couldn't fight these men off. Not like this. Not when they had the upper hand. I had to stay calm and wait for the right moment, because this was far from over. I kept my eyes locked on the two officers, hoping they would notice my defiance, hoping they would feel the weight of the situation as they joked and took photos. If they had thought for a moment about who they were dealing with, maybe they would have had second thoughts. But in their minds, I was just some woman who had walked into the wrong place at the wrong time. a target for their sick amusement. "You know, it's not too late to make this more fun," Officer Smirk said, his voice dripping with mockery. He leaned in closer, camera still in hand. "We could make a game of it. Maybe we'll get a good viral video out of this." He snapped another picture, his laughter echoing in the empty park. His partner, Officer Chuckles, just stood back, arms folded, watching the whole thing unfold like it was some twisted entertainment. But as their laughter rang out, something inside me started to shift. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. No way. I took a slow, measured breath, feeling the burn of the ropes cutting into my wrists. I had been thinking about the worst-case scenario, but now I was focused on something different: revenge. I wasn't going to fight them with force, but I knew how to make them feel what they were doing to me. "Is this really how you get your kicks?" I called out to them, my voice steady but biting. "I mean, what are you even hoping to prove here?" Both of them froze, surprised by the shift in my tone. Officer Chuckles gave me a once-over, clearly unsure of how to respond. But Officer Smirk, the one with the camera, couldn't hide his discomfort. He lowered the phone slightly, his smirk faltering just enough for me to notice. I pressed on, using the edge in my voice to hit them where it hurt. "Do your moms know what you guys are up to on weekends? Do they know you tie women to trees for fun, make them the subject of your sick jokes?" There was a brief moment of silence, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in their eyes, a realization that maybe, just maybe, they had crossed a line. They exchanged glances, but neither of them spoke. It was like they didn't know how to react to me not shrinking in fear, to me not begging for them to let me go. I could feel my anger begin to shift, turning into something colder, sharper. This wasn't just about me anymore. This wasn't just about my humiliation. This was about holding them accountable for their actions, something they clearly hadn't even thought about. They were so used to their power, so used to getting away with things like this, that they never thought there might be consequences. But I was going to make sure they learned otherwise. "Get a good picture, officer," I asked again, this time my tone steely. "Maybe you'll win an award for Best Prank of the Year. You should be real proud of yourselves." Another silence. I could see the cracks starting to show. They were losing control. The playful banter from earlier had faded, replaced by the uneasy tension of realizing they were in a situation they hadn't expected. I was no longer just a woman tied to a tree for their amusement. I was a problem they didn't know how to handle. Officer Smirk cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. But it was clear that his earlier confidence had started to slip. He looked over at Officer Chuckles, as if seeking reassurance, but even the younger officer seemed uncertain now. He shifted his weight, eyes darting nervously around the empty park. They were starting to realize they weren't dealing with some helpless, scared victim. "I think it's time to let her go," Officer Chuckles said finally, his voice lacking the bravado it had earlier. But it wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an offer of an explanation. It was simply a statement, as if he expected me to simply accept that they would untie me, and that would be the end of it. I didn't answer him right away. I just kept staring at them. My eyes narrowed, as if daring them to try something else. I wanted them to feel my gaze, the weight of what they had done, and know that their actions had consequences, whether they were ready for them or not. But instead of acting, they hesitated. For a split second, they exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They were trying to figure out what to do next, what to say to make this situation go away. And that was when I realized, whatever they had planned for me, they hadn't expected it to blow up like this. They hadn't anticipated the possibility of someone fighting back, of someone not folding under the weight of their power. Finally, Officer Smirk stepped forward, muttering something about not wanting to make a scene. He untied the rope from around my wrists, but the damage had already been done. The humiliation, the anger, and the fear were already coursing through me, but I kept it together. I stood tall as he untied the last knot, refusing to show weakness in front of them. "You're free to go," he said curtly, stepping back. But I didn't move. I stood there, holding my ground, making them feel the weight of what had just happened. The park was still empty, but I could feel the heat of their discomfort radiating in the air. "I won't forget this," I said, my voice low but firm. "You may have gotten away with it today, but I won't let this slide." Their faces tightened, but neither of them responded. Instead, they turned and walked away, the tension between them palpable. I watched them leave, my heart still pounding in my chest, but my spirit stronger than ever. As I began to walk away from the tree, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. Yes, I had been humiliated. Yes, I had been caught off guard by their cruelty. But I wasn't broken. I wasn't going to let them make me feel small. In fact, they had done just the opposite. They had given me something to fight for. I wasn't sure where this would go next, but I knew one thing. I wasn't about to let them get away with it. Not by a long shot. The reckoning. The days that followed were a blur of emotions: anger, confusion, frustration, and yet, in some strange way, relief. Relief that I had made it through that morning. Relief that I was still standing, despite everything those officers had tried to do. But as the hours passed, I realized something that gnawed at me. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The park incident, as humiliating as it was just the tip of the iceberg. It was a reminder of how people in power, especially those wearing uniforms, could treat others like they were invisible, as if our humanity didn't matter. It was a stark example of a system that had become so ingrained in its own privilege that it forgot what real accountability looked like. But it was also a reminder that those in power could be held accountable. I couldn't let them get away with this. I had to do something. I wasn't just going to walk away and let it slide, as tempting as it was to pretend like it hadn't happened. I had my dignity, and more importantly, I had my voice, and I was going to use it. The first thing I did was file a formal complaint with the police department. It felt like a small step, like a single raindrop in a thunderstorm. But I knew it was necessary. I wanted to make sure that what had happened to me wouldn't just be brushed under the rug. I documented everything. The officers' names, their behavior, how they had treated me, and the way they had manipulated the situation for their own amusement. I made sure the department knew how deeply their actions had impacted me, and I demanded an investigation. It wasn't easy. I knew that going up against the police could be a dangerous game, but what else could I do? What was the alternative? Let them walk away unscathed. Let them do the same thing to someone else. No, I couldn't live with myself if I allowed that to happen. When the complaint went through, I expected some pushback. After all, the police department wasn't exactly known for holding its officers accountable, especially when it came to issues of race and abuse of power. But I didn't care. I was already in too deep to back up now. A week later, I got a call that I never expected. It was from a woman named Sarah, a reporter for a local news station. She had seen the viral video of the incident, and she wanted to know if I was willing to share my story. At first, I hesitated. The idea of putting myself out there, of publicly reliving that moment in front of thousands of people, made my stomach turn. But then I realized something that changed my mind. The video had gone viral. Yes, but it was also a way to make sure that my voice wasn't drowned out. It was a way to ensure that those officers would not escape the consequences of their actions. If I could shine a light on this, maybe I could help bring change to a system that desperately needed it. The next few days were a whirlwind. Sarah and I met a few times to discuss the interview, and each time I felt more and more certain that this was the right thing to do. She was kind, empathetic, and determined to get the story right. She didn't just want to sensationalize the incident for clicks. She wanted to make sure the truth came out, unfiltered and unedited. That meant everything to me. When the day of the interview came, I was nervous, but I kept my focus. This wasn't about me. It was about what I could do for others who had been silenced, who had been marginalized, who had suffered at the hands of people in positions of power. If I could make a difference, even in some small way, it would all be worth it. Sitting there in front of the camera, With Sarah asking me questions about what happened that day, I could feel my heart racing. But I also felt a deep sense of resolve. I wasn't just telling my story. I was speaking for all the people who had been mistreated, who had been abused by authority, who had been subjected to cruelty because they didn't fit the narrow mold of what respectable people looked like. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. I was just running. I had every right to be there, to take care of myself, and to be treated with respect. Instead, I was mocked. I was humiliated, and I was made to feel like I was less than human. Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with empathy. What do you hope happens as a result of this story? I hope that people realize that this happens all the time, I replied. I hope that people see that the system is broken and that it's up to us to demand change. This isn't just about me. It's about all the people who get mistreated every day, people who are denied their dignity because of who they are, people who are treated like jokes, like pawns. This has to stop. As I spoke those words, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I wasn't alone anymore. I had made my voice heard, and I wasn't going to stop fighting for what was right. The story aired a few days later, and the response was overwhelming. Social media exploded with support, with people from all walks of life condemning the actions of the officers. It didn't take long for people to start asking questions, for the press to demand answers from the police department. Suddenly, the two officers who had thought they were untouchable found themselves under a microscope. They couldn't hide behind their badge anymore. It didn't end there. The story caught the attention of local civil rights organizations who rallied behind me, offering legal support and advocating for justice. They helped me file a lawsuit against the officers and the police department. It was a daunting task, but it was one I was ready for. No one had the right to treat me the way they had, and no one had the right to make someone else feel small in the name of their own twisted amusement. As the lawsuit progressed, I watched with a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction as the officers' actions began to unravel. The public pressure mounted. Video footage from bystanders, both from the day of the incident and from previous encounters, surfaced, painting a clear picture of a pattern of misconduct. The officers had crossed a line, and they were finally going to pay for it. And yet, I knew that the road ahead was still long. There were those who would defend the officers, who would argue that I was exaggerating, that I was overreacting. But I didn't care about their opinions anymore. I wasn't doing this for them. I was doing this for me, for the woman I was becoming, for every person who had ever been wronged and was afraid to stand up. This was about all of us. The day we finally won the case was one I would never forget. It wasn't about the money or the public recognition. It was about the justice that had been denied to me, and the message it sent to the world, that we would not be silent, that we would not be intimidated, and that we would hold the powerful accountable for their actions. The victory was sweet, but the battle didn't stop there. The ripples from that moment would continue to affect change in ways I couldn't have imagined. People would talk about the woman who stood up for herself, who refused to back down. And maybe, just maybe, they would learn that when we fight for our dignity, we fight for everyone's. In the end, it wasn't just about what those officers had done to me. It was about showing the world that even in the face of injustice, we have the power to rise, to speak, and to make sure that justice is served. The unraveling. The victory felt surreal, like a distant dream that I wasn't entirely sure had come true. But when the gavel came down in that courtroom, and the judge declared the officers accountable for their actions, it was a powerful affirmation of what I had always known deep down, that no one, no matter their position or their badge, was above the law. The backlash for the police department was immediate. The community rallied behind me in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Protests spread through the city, peaceful and organized, with banners and signs that declared justice for Kira and accountability now. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the systemic abuse of power that had been allowed to fester for too long. It was about the larger fight for equality, for respect, for dignity for every person, regardless of their race, gender, or status. But as the momentum grew, so did the challenges. The backlash didn't just come from the police department. It came from within the city itself. The resistance from the law enforcement community was palpable. Officers who felt like I had shamed their profession began to turn on me. The media tried to sensationalize the story, often twisting facts or downplaying the severity of what had happened. And those who didn't support the movement began questioning my intentions, accusing me of being a troublemaker who just wanted to stir up drama. Some even claimed I was exaggerating the abuse. What I had experienced in that park wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern of abuse, one that, unfortunately, many people in positions of power didn't want to acknowledge. It was easier to ignore the truth than to face it, especially when it meant confronting deep-rooted corruption. But I wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. What had happened to me, while deeply personal, had been a wake-up call to a much bigger issue. I couldn't ignore it anymore, not when there were so many others like me, those who had suffered in silence, too afraid to speak up or afraid of the consequences. A week after the courtroom victory, I found myself sitting across from an attorney named Michael Turner. He had been a mentor to me during the case, offering advice and guidance. But today, we were talking strategy. He was an experienced litigator with a history of taking on difficult cases. His reputation for bringing cases like mine to the forefront made him a valuable ally. "We have the public's attention," Michael said, his voice calm yet firm. "But we need to keep pushing, Kira. This fight doesn't end with the lawsuit. This is about changing the system. You've sparked something. People are listening now." I nodded, my thoughts drifting to the months of quiet struggles and private frustrations that had led to this moment. The police officers who had humiliated me in the park didn't just hurt me. They hurt my community. They hurt the very fabric of what this country should stand for: justice and equality. Michael's words were the spark I needed. He wasn't just talking about going after the officers, although that was still very much on the table. He was talking about holding the entire department accountable for a history of abuse that stretched back decades. He was talking about suing for reforms in the way the police department operated, not just punishing the individuals responsible for my mistreatment. "We can make them feel the weight of their actions," he said. "But we also have to make sure they understand that this kind of behavior can't continue. We have to use this case as a foundation for something bigger." That was when it hit me. This wasn't just a case about me being tied to a tree in a park. It wasn't just about the officers laughing at my expense or humiliating me. It was about a history of unchecked power, of officers who believed they could do whatever they wanted without facing consequences. It was about making sure that the next time someone like me, a woman of color, or anyone else for that matter, was mistreated, they didn't have to go through what I had. As we plotted the next phase of our strategy, I knew we were heading into uncharted territory. Taking on a police department was no small feat. The system wasn't designed to let people like me win. It wasn't designed to give people the voice and platform they needed to expose the truth. But I wasn't afraid anymore. A month after the courtroom victory, I found myself standing in front of a packed room at a city council meeting, microphone in hand. The room was filled with local leaders, citizens, and even a few police officers, all waiting to hear my testimony. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on me. This was it, my chance to make sure the world saw what had happened and to demand that it never happen again. "I'm here to tell you that what happened to me was not an isolated incident," I began, my voice steady but full of the emotion I had carried with me for so long. "I'm here to tell you that the behavior these officers displayed is not an anomaly. It is a reflection of a larger problem, one that exists in this city and in countless others across the country." I paused, glancing at the faces in the room. Some looked sympathetic, others looked defensive, but none of that mattered to me. This wasn't about winning people over. This was about standing in my truth, about making sure the voices of the oppressed were heard, loud and clear. "I'm not just fighting for myself," I continued, my voice rising with a renewed sense of purpose. I'm fighting for every single person who has been harassed, humiliated, or silenced by those who are supposed to protect us. I'm fighting for every person who has had their dignity stripped away because of the color of their skin, because of their gender, or because they dared to challenge the status quo. The room was silent, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel the gravity of what I had just said. This wasn't just about a personal grievance. This was about dismantling an oppressive system. This was about holding those who thought they were untouchable accountable. This was about change. As the meeting continued, I could see the wheels turning in the minds of the officials and the police officers in the room. They were starting to realize that this wasn't a fight that could be ignored. They were starting to see that my story wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger disease. It wasn't going to be easy. I knew that. The road to true justice would be long and fraught with obstacles. But I also knew that I was no longer alone. The community was with me. The people who had supported me, who had cheered me on, who had shared my story. They weren't backing down either. And together, we were going to make sure that the system that had allowed my humiliation would never again be allowed to do the same to anyone else. The victory in court had been just the beginning. The real work had only just begun. The tipping point. The days following my testimony at the city council meeting were a whirlwind. The media coverage was relentless. My face, no longer just the face of a woman tied to a tree in a park, was now associated with something much bigger. It had become a symbol of resistance, of defiance against the systemic abuse of power. What I had hoped for was starting to happen. People were starting to listen, and they were starting to demand answers. I had barely caught my breath from the last round of interviews when I received a call that would change everything. It was from the FBI. Ms. Adams, the agent on the other end, said, his tone businesslike, but with an undercurrent of respect. "We need to talk." I paused. The sudden seriousness of the call put me on edge, but I had learned over the past few months that everything, every conversation, every interaction, mattered. I told the agent to meet me at my office. An hour later, a black SUV pulled up outside, and two men in dark suits stepped out. They walked into my office like they owned the place, their badges clipped to their belts. They introduced themselves as Special Agent Carter and Agent Daniels. I had no idea why the FBI was involved, but I wasn't about to be intimidated. I sat behind my desk, hands folded in front of me, watching them carefully. "We've been following your case, Ms. Adams," Agent Carter said, sliding a folder across the desk, "and we found something that might be of interest to you." I raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond. Carter opened the folder, pulling out a series of photographs. They were of the two officers, the ones who had tied me to that tree. But these weren't just any photos. They were taken from surveillance footage, and in some of them, the officers were meeting with individuals who appeared to be connected to organized crime. "Your situation," Agent Daniels began, "wasn't an isolated incident. These officers, as well as several others in the department, have been involved in more than just harassment. They've been complicit in a number of illegal activities, including trafficking and corruption, and it seems they've been operating under the radar for quite some time." The weight of their words hit me hard. What had happened to me was just the tip of the iceberg, but now there was something bigger at play. I had never imagined that my fight for justice would become entangled in a web of corruption and criminal activity that stretched far beyond the police force I had confronted. These officers were not just bullies. They were criminals. "But why are you telling me this?" I asked. "What does this have to do with me?" Agent Carter leaned forward, his expression serious. "We believe you've unwittingly become part of a much larger case. The officers who mistreated you are tied to a network of illegal activities, and we need someone on the inside to help us bring it all down." I blinked, processing what he was saying. "You want me to help you take down the entire department?" Agent Daniels nodded. "Yes. We've been working on this investigation for months, but we haven't been able to get the evidence we need. We believe that the scandal surrounding your arrest could be the catalyst we need to expose everything." I was stunned. My first instinct was to walk away. This wasn't something I'd signed up for. I had simply wanted justice for what had happened to me. But as I thought about it, I realized how much bigger this could be. If I took this opportunity, I could help uncover a vast network of corruption that had been operating right under our noses. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting the future, about making sure that no one else ever had to suffer the way I had. After a long pause, I finally spoke. "What do you need me to do?" Agent Carter's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "We need you to help us gather evidence. We need you to act as if you're continuing your fight for justice against the officers who harmed you. But in doing so, you'll be helping us uncover everything they've been hiding. We can't do this without your cooperation." The weight of the decision was heavy. I had already faced unimaginable humiliation and had fought tooth and nail to get to this point. Now I was being asked to become a part of something even bigger, something that would put me in danger in ways I couldn't even begin to fathom. But I knew what I had to do. "I'm in," I said, my voice firm. "But I want full protection. If I'm going to be in this, I need to know that you'll keep me safe." The agents exchanged a look, then nodded in agreement. "You'll have protection. We'll make sure of it." The next few weeks were a blur. I began gathering evidence, working with the FBI to tap into a network of confidential informants and surveillance footage. I had to play my role carefully, pretending that I was still focused solely on exposing the officers who had wronged me. But all the while, I was working behind the scenes, uncovering a maze of corruption that reached deep into the heart of the city's police force. Every day felt like a tightrope walk. One wrong move, one slip-up, and everything would come crashing down. The two officers, Chuckles and Smirk, were still out there, completely unaware that their every move was being watched. They continued to harass and intimidate people, but now I was there, quietly documenting their every action, collecting the pieces that would bring their entire operation to its knees. It was difficult, exhausting work, but I couldn't stop now. The stakes were too high. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone who had ever been wronged by a corrupt system, everyone who had been made to feel small, unworthy, or powerless. This wasn't just about one woman and one humiliating incident. It was about the future of a community, about ensuring that the people who were supposed to protect us were held accountable for the harm they had caused. But just when I thought I was getting close to exposing everything, something unexpected happened. One of the officers, Officer Smirk, approached me, a sly grin on his face. He seemed to know something was off, and his behavior grew increasingly erratic. It was clear that he was starting to sense that I wasn't just another woman seeking revenge for her humiliation. He was starting to catch on to the bigger picture, and he wasn't happy about it. That was when I knew the next phase of this battle was about to begin. The FBI was ready to take down the entire operation, but I had to get through this next part without blowing my cover. The real fight was just beginning, and I had to be more careful than ever before. The reckoning. The days after Smirk's unsettling approach were tense, a constant game of cat and mouse. I had become acutely aware that the officers were catching on. They were suspicious. Their movements were more deliberate, their smiles less frequent. I couldn't let my guard down. If I was going to see this through, I had to be smarter, faster, and more strategic than I ever thought possible. But despite the overwhelming weight of the situation, I was not about to back down. I had come too far. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the countless others who had been subjected to the same abuse, the same manipulation, the same corrupt system. The stakes had grown higher than I could have ever imagined. I spent my days carefully walking the tightrope of normalcy, acting like everything was still the same. At work, I maintained a professional demeanor. To the outside world, I was just a woman trying to rebuild her life after an attack by the very officers sworn to protect her. But behind closed doors, I was gathering information, piecing together the puzzle of corruption that had taken root in the city's law enforcement. Every interaction, Every moment was a step closer to exposing everything. It wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. It was about creating a narrative that would be impossible to ignore, one that would force the hand of justice. The FBI had been invaluable in helping me gather intel and build a case, but now, the moment was approaching when we would have to go public. The question was, how could we ensure that the officers who had wronged me and countless others would be brought to justice without everything falling apart? That's when I learned that it wasn't just the officers I needed to worry about. It was the system itself. As I worked with Agent Carter and Daniels, we uncovered more than we had anticipated. The corrupt officers, Smirk and Chuckles, were not lone wolves. They were part of a larger ring, one that included higher-ups in the department, politicians, and even judges who had been turning a blind eye to their illegal activities for years. The more we dug, the more the pieces fell into place. We discovered that these officers were part of an underground syndicate that was involved in everything from bribery and extortion to drug trafficking and money laundering. They had been using their positions of power to cover up their crimes, manipulating the very system they had sworn to uphold. It was a gut-wrenching realization. I had never imagined that the system I had trusted would be so deeply compromised. But it also gave me the clarity I needed. The truth had to come out, and it had to come out now. The FBI was planning a large-scale operation to take down the entire syndicate, but the timing was crucial. Smirk and Chuckles, along with their colleagues, would need to be arrested in a way that would ensure the case could hold up in court. If we moved too quickly, they would cover their tracks. If we waited too long, they might disappear. And that's when everything came to a head. Smirk made his move. It was a Friday evening when I received an anonymous tip. The message was simple. Smirk knows you're onto him. He's planning something big tonight. Be careful. I read the message twice, trying to decipher what it meant. It wasn't just a warning. It was a signal. He was going to make his move. And if I didn't act fast, I could be caught in the crossfire. I immediately contacted Agent Carter, who confirmed that Smirk had been under surveillance for the past few days. He was getting nervous, and his behavior was becoming more erratic. But Carter assured me that they were prepared to act. The operation was already in motion. Smirk's days of abusing his power were numbered. But then, the unexpected happened. The following night, as I walked back to my apartment after an exhausting day of strategizing with the FBI, I felt the familiar, uneasy sensation of being watched. My instincts kicked in, but I didn't turn around. I knew I had to keep moving. It was too late to go back. Suddenly, I heard a car pull up behind me, the engine purring softly as it slowed to a stop. I quickened my pace, my heart racing, but it was no use. The car rolled up next to me, and the door opened with a quiet click. Out stepped Smirk. His face was grim, his expression cold. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, I could see the realization flicker behind them. He knew I had been working with the FBI. He knew I was the one who had been gathering evidence against him. And now he was cornering me. I didn't have time to think. I had to act. Before he could say anything, I reached for the phone in my pocket and hit the number for Agent Carter. I didn't say a word as I held the phone to my ear, praying that he was listening, praying that help was on the way. Smirk must have seen the move, because the next thing I knew, his hand was on my arm, pulling me roughly toward the car. "You think you're clever, don't you?" He sneered, his breath hot against my ear. "You think you can take me down? You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." I didn't struggle. I didn't flinch. I just stared at him, my resolve hardening with every passing second. "You're the one who doesn't get it," I said, my voice steady and clear. "This is over, Smirk. The whole damn thing. Your days of terrorizing people are done." He grinned, clearly enjoying the moment. "You think you're some hero, huh?" Before I could respond, the sound of sirens broke the night air. Smirk's grin faltered, and he turned, looking over his shoulder. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the headlights of the FBI's SUVs roaring down the street toward him. The agents moved swiftly. In a matter of seconds, Smirk was on the ground, his hands cuffed behind his back. The FBI had acted fast. The syndicate was crumbling before his eyes. Chuckles and the rest of their crew had been caught in a coordinated takedown. As I watched Smirk being led away, my heart pounded, not from fear, but from a deep, indescribable sense of justice. This was the moment. It wasn't just the end of his reign of terror. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chance to rebuild the system that had failed so many. In the days that followed, the details of the operation became public. Smirk, Chuckles, and several others were arrested on charges ranging from corruption to conspiracy. The truth came to light, and the city was forced to reckon with its broken system. The officers' actions had been nothing short of criminal, and the public outcry was immense. But there was hope. People were talking. People were demanding change. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had done something real, something that mattered. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the community, about every person who had ever been treated unfairly, about the future we were going to build together. The reckoning had come, and the world was going to be different from here on out.